It's time to talk about that most difficult and satisfying part of writing, the ending. Hello, welcome back to my channel. My name is Carly Stevens, and this is Carly Stevens Books for all things writing, publishing, and indie author life. If you don't know me, I am an indie author, and I taught for many years, and this is one of the topics that I feel most passionate about. There is something about nailing the ending that is so crucial to having a book that you can be proud of, that people recommend to their friends, that there's nothing like it. There's nothing like a great ending. So I'm going to, in this video, walk you through what I learned about endings and how to make them memorable, satisfying, wrap things up, but not merely wrap things up, to do so in a way that is fulfilling for both you and the reader. I will include some practical exercises and tips in this video as well, so if you are inclined to follow along and treat this as a sort of step-by-step brainstorming session, then please feel free to pause when you need to, take screenshots, all that good stuff. But without further ado, let's talk about writing endings. I want to begin with brainstorming. Think now about your story. I assume that you have one if you're considering what the ending is going to look like, either in, a nearly completed stage, or perhaps you're outlining and the ending just isn't feeling right and you can't pinpoint why. Let's brainstorm your particular story. The first question I have for you are, what are some of the most important themes in your story? I'm going to explain why I'm asking these questions here in a bit, but what are some of the most important themes? Now, some of you hear the word theme and you think back to English class, which isn't a bad thing, I hope. If you were in my class, then hopefully it's not. But anyway, a theme is just a big idea that the story tackles from a variety of different sides. So, in romances, it's very common for love and the idea that love conquers all, or the question, can love conquer all, to be a major theme that's looked at in a variety of different ways and through a variety of scenarios. In my most popular book, Laertes, a dark academia Hamlet retelling set in the 1920s, there are a couple major themes. Identity is one. Who is Laertes really? He's always compared to Hamlet. He's always compared to Ophelia. He's always described in relation to his father, but who is he? And can he become the sort of man that he wants to become? So there's that question of identity. And then another theme, just so you have some concrete examples, is forgiveness, because I wanted this was a unique situation because I knew what the final scene was going to be, and I wanted it to have that emotional resonance. And in order to do so, there needed to be the fulfillment of the theme of forgiveness, and so I needed to seed that all the way back through the book. So think about your story and whether or not it's a very serious literary style work like this one, or something that is lighter like a romance or a fantasy adventure. What are some of those themes that your story has dealt with? Okay, question 2 and 3 are kind of connected, but think to yourself what sorts of endings you like. So what books, movies, stories have your favorite types of endings, and then take it one step further. Why do you like that ending so much? What aspects of it do you love? So when I was going to write the ending of my trilogy, more on that later, I thought, I need to nail this ending, because some books that I love until the ending, and that really bothers me. And there's something so moving and so great about an ending that is, just really well done. So I had recently finished the Lunar Chronicles by Marissa Meyer. Winter is the final one in the quartet. And I thought, that is an ending. And then Avengers Endgame came out, and I thought, that is an ending. And so I started tearing apart what it was that made those two. Those are kind of my templates in a way, my studies. What was it that made those two so emotionally satisfying for me as a viewer or as a reader. So yours might not be the exact same, but what are some of those endings that just make you go, oh my gosh, that was incredible? And ask yourself why. And then, kind of as a bonus, then what are some books, movies, stories that have terrible endings that didn't match the rest of the story or ruined the rest of the story for you? My example for this is The True Confessions of Charlotte Doyle by Avi. This was a book that was one of my favorites when I was 13. I read it multiple times, loved it, but the ending is stupid. And so I decided to just say, well, that's not canon, maybe the ending was something else. But it was hard to swallow that such an amazing book had such a stupid, horrible ending. I'm not in the business here of spoiling things, so I'm going to be speaking kind of vaguely about endings in case you want to read these books for yourself or see these things. But I do want to give you some concrete examples at the same time. So in any case, I did not want to do what The True Confessions of Charlotte Doyle did in my work, and so I thought, all right, that was unrealistic, that didn't match the tone of the rest of the story, and kind of did the same sort of work, but on the opposite side. This is not what I want to do. This is what I want to avoid. What would you say, thinking again to your story, is the purpose of your story? Now, for some, the purpose might be some kind of message that you're trying to get across. For some, it's just entertainment or escape. There are different types of purposes that your story can have. It doesn't have to be the kind of story that teaches. It can be just purely for fun and escapism, and that's legitimate too. But identify what is that is the purpose of your story, so that you can nail that ending in a way that honors the point of the whole thing. What was the purpose of writing it? And then, continuing with our brainstorming session, this is so good, this is so juicy. You're going to use all these little pieces to make your ending shine for your story particularly, just trust me. So next, I am a huge fan of lists. If you've been around the channel, then you know that I did a whole video on id lists, just those personal preferences that are unique to you, that don't necessarily have like mass market appeal, but dang it, you love when it starts snowing in a story, or you like when, the male MC leans against a door jamb, or you like the dynamic of a huge dragon looming over a tiny person, or whatever it is, right? So think now more specifically, not just to general things that you enjoy seeing, but what would you like to see before the end of your book? Is there a character scenario that you didn't have time to explore? Is there a place in your world that you didn't get to see? Is there a relationship that you wanted to, let them have a moment? Did you want to see somebody facing their fears and overcoming them? Just almost like a fan fiction wish list of your own story. What would you love to see before the end? Now, there's no guarantee that you're going to be able to fit in all of those things. Maybe they don't make logical sense, or there's just not a lot of space for that when you're focused on this huge battle or whatever it is. But make your personal wish list of things that you would like to see, and then see where and if you can weave those things in. This was something that I did, again, as I was working on the finale to my trilogy, the Tanyuan Academy series, which is a young adult fantasy series about a warrior academy and a guy who's willing to do anything to be the best. Little does he know that both he and the princess of the kingdom are caught up in a much bigger struggle for power than either one of them realizes. So it turns out to be really epic and huge, and there are a million characters, and I was so stressed about getting the ending right because I had 2 books out and I didn't know how it was going to end. And one thing I did was this. I thought, okay, I have all these characters. What do I want to see before the end? And I listed out those things. And then one last piece of brainstorming for you, and that is, what do you want readers to feel when they finish the final page. Or if you don't want to think about readers' reactions quite yet, you're still, thinking through your own stuff, then how do you want to feel at the end? Do you want to feel kind of, nostalgic and thoughtful? So that would be like the end of Laertes. I wanted people to cry, but not in a hopeless way, in a way that made them view their own lives as more beautiful. So cry at the tragedy of it in the truest sense, right? Tragedy is not tragedy unless the people matter, unless you matter. And so anyway, that was what I wanted to leave people with, is that melancholy, thoughtful appreciation of their own lives and sadness at what had just happened. So what sense do you want to leave your readers with? Do you want them to feel joy? Do you want them to be kind of introspective? Consider, what is that last note? Because the final note is one that will resonate and continue to kind of play after people read your story. Now let's get into some of the nitty-gritty. You have all of this brainstorming stuff, and you're going to use it as fodder for your amazing ending. But let's talk about endings a little bit here, just in general. There are several different ending styles that you can use as a storyteller to wrap things up. A very common way to kind of formulate your ending is a circular ending. So that would be something like The Hobbit. The Hobbit is almost perfectly circular rather. You start with Bilbo in his hobbit hole, and then he goes on his adventure and he returns and he ends in the same place that he physically was, at least at the beginning of the story, even though internally he has had a lot of change and experience and all of that. So it makes it very easy to give a snapshot of before and after, because there's a circularness to it all. That's a very common way of going about things. Linear is also pretty common. You go from point A to point B, but they are very far apart. The journey that the characters have undergone is significant, and there is no return to that original state. No, they've gone beyond that. So the Lunar Chronicles, which I showed you before, is definitely a linear story. By the time you get to the end, too much has happened. You don't go back to where you were before, both either physically or emotionally or anything like that. There's an open-ended sort of ending, which is not the most popular, but it kind of is a, choose your own adventure, decide how you want to interpret this sort of ending. Brave New World by Aldous Huxley is this way. Castaway, the movie with Tom Hanks, is this way. To a much smaller degree, there's at least a note of open-endedness to the Tanywood Academy series, so I chose a little bit of this. Although not completely. There were a lot of things that I firmed up. And then fourth is a cliffhanger ending. If you choose either an open-ended ending or a cliffhanger ending, people might just hate you, but you can also hook them into the next book. If you're writing a series, then I would not recommend ending on a cliffhanger if you're not going to write a second book. People have gotten away with that before, having a sort of open-ended, bordering on cliffhanger ending, like If We Were Villains by M.L. Rio. But I would not go with a cliffhanger unless you have a series in mind, and even then I would be careful with that. So if you have read Fourth Wing by Rebecca Yarros, as many of us have, then you know that there is a cliffhanger ending, and then it just cuts to credits immediately, and you're like, oh my gosh, well what? And you feel the need to move on to the next book. So you don't have to decide, choose A, B, C, D of these options, but just having a better understanding of how endings can work and the options that are available can spark some, hopefully, options in your own mind about how you can end your story. I think regardless of the style of story ending that you choose, there should be some echo of the beginning at the end, even if it's not a fully circular story like The Hobbit. Having a snapshot that gives you a sense of the before and the after is important, I believe, to an emotionally resonant ending. Even if that is maybe not a visual so much as a thought that they had at the beginning that is then echoed at the end, but different now that the person has changed. And, look at what they've gone through, whatever that might be, that adventure, that relationship, that whatever. And so we get to see, we can compare who they were and who they are. Speaking of character arcs, let's talk about them. The most important element, I think, to a satisfying ending is the sense of a character arc, the character changing. Maybe it's not the only thing that's going to make an ending emotionally satisfying, but it certainly is the main one. So consider, once again, this is you considering your own story. How will your main character change? Or maybe you're almost finished and you're just figuring out the last details. How have they changed? And what is that final, push at the end? How are they different at the end than at the beginning? I mean, that's the basis of a character arc in general, right? How will you demonstrate that change? So it's not enough to say, well, I'm different now. There should be, I think, and there's an exception to every rule, but 99.9 times out of 100, there should be some demonstration of that change so we can see it in action. We can see that the timid person became brave. We can see that the person who couldn't forgive themselves has now forgiven themselves in this very tangible fashion. Maybe they've said it aloud to somebody they thought they would never speak to, or whatever it is. But how are we going to know that they've changed apart from just being told that? Have you made them face their fears or their lies that held them back at the beginning? Maybe they thought that they weren't lovable, and then they have to face the reality that somebody does love them, and maybe their ideas change on that front. And then remember that you have more characters than just your main character or characters. You have secondary characters as well. Now, I'm not going to say that each and every one of them needs a character arc, because that is insane. That's, not everybody changes at the same time because of the same events, and maybe your story is not about all of the bartenders and the journey that they've gone on. But think about your secondary characters and which ones have also been changing along the way, and how can you show that in a way that is true to your story, true to their character, true to the themes and things that you brainstormed before. For example, I said that I was going to talk about that trilogy that set me on this whole journey of learning about endings in the first place. The Tanyuan Academy series, this is all 3 books in one. It was an enormous undertaking, and so I knew how I wanted my 2 main characters, my 2 point of view characters to change. Firion has a lot of issues, many issues. So his change was going to be the most dramatic and the most difficult to pull off. Kyria, the princess, was going to be much more natural to do. It's really just her becoming stronger and firmer in her, ability to lead and her beliefs, and just, becoming this powerhouse. So I knew I could do that. But then there are other secondary characters as well that have been growing this whole time. So my favorite example of one of my favorite examples of this, I have a couple because I've really spent some quality time with these folks, is Bard, Firion's roommate. He is somebody who's naturally, he thinks about the worst case scenario. He's very cautious. He is caring, but is not somebody who goes out there and takes risks. He tends to be soft-spoken, that kind of thing. And by the end, he is becoming this leader who's able to speak in front of people, even though he is still not an extroverted character. But he's basically himself 2.0. So what are your characters that can be themselves 2.0 by the end of the story? The change that Bard undergoes and several of the other side characters are the ones that I hear about most often as like the favorites, the fan favorites. So again, food for thought. Have you made those characters face their fears? Have you made those characters demonstrate a change? Plot. So we talked about some characters, let's talk about some plot. Plot arcs are also about change, but it's external instead of internal. So what has changed? Well, I guess it's both external and internal. So what has changed in general over the course of the story? Not only the character arcs, although that is an integral part of what a plot is, but what has changed overall. So for example, Book Lovers by Emily Henry, which is one of my favorite romances to this day. So Nora has gotten together with Charlie, which is not a spoiler because it's a romance. You're going to end with a happily ever after. It's the two characters on the front. And she also has a storyline with her sister Libby, who is moving, and there are all these difficulties with that. And that also has created this enormous change in Nora's life from the beginning of the story to the end. And so there are a few levels of things that have changed that are no longer the same as they were at the beginning. If nothing's changing, if you're just kind of following people around, then you don't really have a story so much. And then, perhaps more importantly, do those changes match up with what you set up at the beginning? So I think one of the issues with Indiana Jones and the Crystal Skull. Now, I'm a huge Indiana Jones fan, but it's limited to Raiders of the Lost Ark and Last Crusade, my two favorites. One of the things that I think didn't resonate with people with the Kingdom of the Crystal Skull is that there were too many things that were set up at the beginning. It ended up feeling random. A lot of it wasn't paid off. By the time you got to the alien reveal at the end, it didn't feel like there was any seeding for that, or at least enough seeding for that ending at the beginning. And so it ended up just feeling like this random conclusion, and it left people feeling very empty and unsatisfied. I don't think it was the fact that it was aliens that was the problem. I think it was the setup and payoff that was totally mishandled, and a lot of things in between as well. So think about the beginning of your story. What have you set up as the problem? Is it the evil empire? Is it the lack of money, and this fisherman needs to make more? Whatever it is. Is it the threat of the world ending? So whatever you've set up at the beginning needs to, even if things completely shift throughout the course of the story, needs to be resolved somehow by the end, or addressed somehow at the end. I'm not going to stand here and tell you that you need to wrap everything up nicely in a nice bow, but there should be at least a comment made about those issues, those character flaws, those things that you emphasized and set up at the beginning. The one trick that I learned as I was doing my research, looking at different things, that was the most helpful, I'd say, in my entire writing career, and certainly for Kingdoms on Fire, the final book in the Tanyuan Academy series, is the idea of paying off promises. This is an idea that I got from Marissa Meyer's Winter, that I got from James Scott Bell's The Last 50 Pages. I believe I did an honest review of that craft book on this channel before. But have you paid off promises? This was I cannot overstate how important this was to me as a writer, understanding how to write a good ending. So there are genre promises. Let's just go through some of what I mean by this. A genre promise of romance is that you will get a happily ever after, or at a minimum, a happy for now, with characters who get together and love conquers all. No matter if you have a Hallmark romance or a steamy romance or anything in between, that is essentially the promise of a romance. So you need to pay that off. You need to give that happily ever after. You need to give that sense that they found love, they found each other, and they're happy. Another type of promise could be teased information that you alluded to earlier, like backstory. Now, you don't need to explain every passing reference that you give or your characters give, but if you've been kind of building this up as something that readers expect to see at some point and then never let them see it, that can also lead to this empty feeling like, well, where there should have been more. So what are those backstories that maybe you could elucidate somewhere near the end? Relationships are kind of that way as well. If you've had people in this sci-fi adventure, kind of making eyes at each other, is it to the point where it's become a promise to the reader that you're going to resolve that somehow or address that somehow or have those characters get together? If you have an implied promise, then pay it off. Another one is there an ability, a power, a weapon, or a type of being that you talk about in a significant way but you haven't shown? Then find a way to show that. What are those things that you have prepared the reader to see? You don't need to do everything that they expect exactly, but you should address those things that you've set up. Set up, payoff, set up, payoff. One of the biggest implied promises is problems that the characters have. Again, it doesn't need to be all pretty and happy at the end. Not everything needs to be perfectly resolved, but it needs to be addressed at least. If characters had a problem at the end, problem in a relationship, a problem, with their car, I don't know, whatever it is that you've set up throughout the story, then start paying off those promises you've made to the reader. So as I was preparing to finish Kingdoms on Fire, which just intimidated the heck out of me. I don't know if you could tell from the extensive research that I did and kind of brainstorming, but I made a whole list. I went back into books 1 and 2 and thought, okay, what have I set up that I haven't yet paid off? What backstories should come up in the final story? What relationships should progress? What have we not seen that we've basically been promised to see up until this point? So I made another list because, I love a list. And I just started paying off those promises one after the other, as the dramatic finale was unfolding. And I am so proud of that ending. And people say that it's the book that reads the fastest by far, and it's significantly longer than the first 2 books just because of a lot of things, but some of it was paying off these promises, paying off plot, paying off character arcs, and landing the plane, as it were. So think, what are some promises that you have set up either intentionally or in an implied way throughout your story? Once you start paying those off, it makes all the difference in the world. All right, a few more additional tips. Make the ending difficult for your characters. Make them earn their ending. This could be a really happy book. That's perfectly fine, but there should be some level of challenge, difficulty, effort involved, or it's not going to have that same fulfillment. to it. So make your characters work for their ending. Don't just drop it in their lap. Like Snow White, who gets whisked away after being kissed when she's unconscious. Like, that's not, even if you like certain visuals of that story, it's not a particularly satisfying ending, because it's like, well, where'd you come from? And you get the idea. Avoid Deus Ex Machina. That's another one. Deus Ex Machina means God out of the machine, which is a reference to, I believe, a dramatic convention that would kind of plug out characters from the problems that they were in. So I basically don't have things change just because somebody else randomly steps in, something just, there's a stroke of luck and none of it's really earned. This was difficult for the character arc of Furion. I mentioned he's a bad fellow in many ways. I love him, but he's hard to love. And I wanted him to have a convincing character arc that didn't have any Deus Ex Machina moments to it, where all of a sudden a switch is flipped, his personality is different, he sees the light now. I wanted it to be realistic, for the steps to be realistic, for all the change to be consistent with his character, and for all those earned changes to make the difference at the end. So it didn't feel like all of a sudden everything's fine at the end in a way that is just like, oh, well, da-da-da, there you go. Speaking of, do your best not to change the characters' personalities suddenly to fit the ending. This can be very tempting because you know where you want to bring your characters. You know that you want them to become more confident. You want them to become more courageous or more caring or whatever it is. But as you are taking your characters from point A to point B, remember, treat them as people. I think if readers can see themselves in characters, even characters that aren't particularly like them, or characters that they don't particularly like, if they can see a realistic progression that fits with the personality of the character, from being caught in negative ways of being to growing and becoming better, that is so satisfying. Now, in my character arc video, I talk about other types of character arcs, but since positive is by far the most popular, and for a reason, that's the only one I'm going to talk about in this video. So fit the ending to their personalities and to the growth that they've achieved as much as possible, rather than trying to shove them into a box that they don't fit. So that is it. I know that's kind of a lot, but go back and consider what themes or messages you want to leave people with, and make sure that the ending emphasizes those messages, those ideas, really confronts those in a meaningful way, both for the theme in general and for the character who's probably wrestling with some of those same questions or ideas. If you want to leave the reader with a very happy feeling, then make the ending happy. If you want them to cry, then make the ending sad or moving in some way. You can look at my video on tone for some ideas for how to do that, but a lot of it's going to come from just seeing how the characters have changed and how they're dealing with being confronted with who they were and showing who they are now. Sometimes it's going to be sad, sometimes it's going to be happy, but it's going to be moving either way. So there you go. My thoughts on endings. If you're interested in the books that I showed you in this video, you can get the Tanyuan Academy Complete Series Shelf Trophy version anywhere books are sold, and you can get the white special edition version of Laertes from Barnes & Noble, or you can just get the regular copy, again, anywhere books are sold. If you haven't listened to the audiobook, you're missing out. It is extraordinary. So yes, what other questions do you have about writing endings? Or if you want to share some of the brainstorming that you've done, feel free to put that in the comments down below. Subscribe if you are new, like this video if you like it, and I'll see you next week.